everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases and all things education related. For today's video, I'm back discussing another unsolved case, and this time it's going to be the case of Angela Hammond. But very quickly, before I jump on into the case, I just want to very briefly just chuck in my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos. I'm in no way, shape or form claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research on the internet, and so because obviously only some sources are accessible to me, it means that I may get things wrong, mispronounce things, leave things out, and I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, we're just going to jump straight ahead and discuss the case of Angela Hammond. Angela Marie Hammond was born on the 9th of February in the year of 1971 in Kansas City, Missouri. Angela lived here with her parents Marcia and Chris Hammond for 4 years until they decided to move to Clinton in Missouri to be closer to Angela's maternal grandparents. At that time, Clinton was a relatively small and close-knit town, with even now the population being less than 10,000 in the most recent years. The residents in the town were particularly familiar with one another because of this, and Marcia, Chris and Angela soon found themselves fitting in well with the new community. Before long, the couple then welcomed Angela's little brother, his name was Lauren, into the world. A few years later, Marcia and Chris sadly found that their marriage was struggling and they ultimately decided to separate, with Chris moving to Kansas and Marcia moving onto a large area of isolated farmland in Montrose in Missouri. Despite their separation and ultimate divorce, both parents were very heavily involved in the upbringing of the children, with their time together being shared evenly. Once settled into their new arrangement, it just seemed to work for all of them extremely well. As Angela grew up, she spent a lot of time in Clinton itself, where she made a lot of friends, the closest of which being a young woman named Kyla Engman. The pair became best friends and completely inseparable, and Kyla continued to remember Angela as an energetic, driven beam of light that made everyone around her particularly happy and positive. By the end of 1990, Angela Hammond was 19 years old, having finished school, being known as particularly intelligent and an impressive student. And it was around this time that she had met Rob Schaefer, who was 18 at the time. Rob had been a star athlete at his school and he had dreamed of enlisting in the military once he'd finished all of his studies. Before long, the pair were in a relationship and they were completely in love with one another. Their relationship appeared to progress pretty quickly, as in January of 1991 she had told Rob that she was carrying his child, and Rob had been ecstatic about the news of the child, and he'd followed up by proposing to Angela, which she'd happily said yes to. And the pair then decided that the next step in their lives together would be to move in together, and so they looked for a small place for them to start their future. They'd settled on renting a trailer home in the local area and began to plan ahead for everything that was to come. Rob's dreams of joining the military hadn't changed, and he had enlisted to join in the summer of 1991. By this point, Angela had a job in the Union State Bank working night shifts, while also simultaneously enrolling herself in college courses in the Central Missouri State University. All in all, the pair appeared to remain completely in love with one another. Their families were both extremely happy for them, and they seemed to be thriving both individually and as a pair. But then comes the day of April the 4th, 1991. It was noted that the weather had been particularly pleasant that week, and as a result, Angela's mother had decided to host a barbecue for her family and friends. Both Angela and her fiancé Rob had headed to her mother's for the evening, and they'd spent the evening enjoying the atmosphere and the company of all of their closest family and friends. At around 9 PM, Angela and Rob had decided that it was time for them to head back to Clinton, as Rob had agreed to babysit his younger brother at his mother's house for the following hour. Angela had agreed to meet up with him once again in town a couple hours later once his mother had returned home to look after his brother, and so in the meantime she decided to meet up with Kyla. They'd spent their time driving around the town having fun, not doing anything in particular, until around 11:15 PM when she said goodbye to her. Angela headed to the payphone next to the local Food Barn store's car parking area with the intention of ringing Rob to tell him that she was heading straight home to have a relaxing bath rather than meeting him in town a few hours later. She was simply too tired to wait for him any longer, and she said she'd meet him at home. They had a phone conversation for around 30 minutes before things started to get strange. During their conversation, Angela had said to Rob that she had noticed an unidentifiable man driving an old Ford F-15 pickup truck in a green colour, driving around the street multiple times in the period of time that she was on the phone to Rob. She'd thought it strange after the first few laps that he'd done of the block, as it seemed less and less likely that he'd maybe taken a wrong turning or he'd gotten lost so many times. It was past 11:45 p.m. at this point, and after telling Rob of the strange sighting, she looked once again, only to spot the truck driving straight towards her at the payphone. The man had pulled over right near the payphones, gotten out of the truck and headed straight for the free payphone next to Angela. He'd stood there for just a few seconds before deciding to head back to his truck, and as Angela watched him, she noticed him pull out a flashlight and move it over the truck as though he was looking for something inside. As the man had been hovering around her while she was on the phone to Rob, she decided to turn to him and ask him if he wanted to use the phone, perhaps thinking that she hadn't noticed whether one of the other payphones hadn't been working, and so she wanted to see if he was waiting for the phone. The man simply replied to her saying no, and this entire encounter had been completely heard on the phone by Rob, who was obviously at his mother's house around 7 blocks away from the payphone. But the next thing Rob heard over the phone had been a blood-curdling scream, and Rob had immediately ran out of the house, jumped straight in his car and headed in the direction of the payphone. As he drove in the direction of the payphone, he noticed a green pickup truck speeding past in the opposite direction, and inside the van he'd spotted a woman attempting to fight off the driver whilst screaming Robbie. He recognised his fiancée immediately and attempted to turn his car around as quickly as possible in hopes of following the speeding truck. Rob had managed to follow directly behind the truck for around 2 miles, but as he made a right turn while he was in pursuit, his car ended up stalling in the middle of the road. He had no choice but to frantically attempt to restart his car, all while watching the truck with his abducted fiancée drive further and further from his eyeline. From here, Rob had decided to abandon his car where it stalled, and he began his walk back into town so he could head straight for the police station. On his way, another driver had spotted him and was able to give him a lift into the town, where he arrived at the police station in the early hours of the morning. According to the police report he had filed, Angela's only description of the man over the phone to Rob had been that the man had been wearing coveralls, a dark baseball hat, glasses, and looked filthy and bearded with a messy full beard and moustache. He'd relayed the description of the van that he'd followed, specifically that it was a green Ford F15 with a white roof and noticeable damage on the front left side. One unusual factor regarding the vehicle itself was that the rear window had actually had a vibrant mural covering the whole of it. The image was of a fish jumping out of water, so that wasn't a common sighting, and it seemed as though at the time that detail would potentially help them in finding the truck. Police officers soon had a composite sketch of the believed abductor ready to be released to the public, but it soon fell under extreme criticism once it was released, namely because virtually all of the pieces of descriptions provided by Rob and essentially Angela, I guess, had been completely overlooked in the sketch. Suspicion soon fell on Rob himself, with the investigators taking the stance that everything about his account of that night seemed too convenient and almost theatrical, as it's very rare that cases like this end up in a car chase cut short by a car malfunction. They did, however, manage to find Rob's abandoned car exactly where he claimed it had stalled, as well as Angela's car in the car park with her belongings still inside. Angela's mother had been notified immediately of her daughter's disappearance, who in turn rang her father. He had headed straight for Clinton, where he would stay for a significant amount of time to be able to help conduct the search for Angela himself. Around this same time, Rob had agreed to take a polygraph test in order to clear his name as the prime suspect in Angela's disappearance, which he did pass. Rob's description of the truck he had followed was also supported when 2 local residents came forward and claimed to have witnessed the same truck around the area that night. The next person the police focused their investigation on had been a 17-year-old named Bill Barker, who had been Angela's previous boyfriend. As investigators had interviewed friends and acquaintances of Angela's, they had caught wind of a rumour claiming that Bill was actually the biological father of Angela's baby, not Rob. Bill and Rob both denied the possibility of these claims, and following their own investigation, police ultimately ruled him out as a suspect as well. Virtually immediately following the disappearance, the entire town came together to spread the word of the search for Angela. The town was plastered with posters of Angela, and hundreds of people had grouped together to form search parties looking for her, but sadly they found nothing. Less than 2 weeks after the disappearance, the local police department decided to seek help and additional resources in the search for Angela, so the Missouri Rural Crime Scene Squad and the Missouri Highway Patrol set out to extend the search. The Highway Patrol team began sifting through their own database, resulting in nearly 2,000 registered trucks matching the description of the one Angela had been abducted in. The owners of each of these matching vehicles were contacted and investigated individually, but sadly nothing relating to Angela's case came about. By this point, every avenue they had searched had been exhausted and they really didn't know where to look next. They decided that they would look into other disappearances around the area and possibly around the same time, just to see if they could identify any potential links with Angela's case and any others. And two cases in particular had stuck out to them, the first being that of 42-year-old Trudy Darby in a place called Max Creek in Missouri on January the 19th that same year, 1991. Trudy had been closing up a local convenience store for the night when she'd become aware of three men hovering outside the shop. She had been unsettled by their presence and she'd rang her son from inside the store. She had asked him to come down to the store and help her close up and then walk her home just to avoid her feeling unsafe. Her son had agreed, but when he had arrived at the store just 10 minutes later, he found no sign of his mother anywhere. And then just 2 days after her disappearance, her remains were found in a nearby river unclothed, and her cause of death was listed as being 2 gunshot wounds to the head. A month after Trudy's disappearance and death, 30-year-old Cheryl Ann Kenny had been working in a local convenience store on Business 71 Highway in a small town in Nevada, Missouri. Typically, the store would be shutting around midnight, but on that night, by about 10 p.m, it had just been Cheryl, a janitor, and one customer inside the store. She decided that since it had been such a slow evening, she told the janitor that they could leave early and that she would be shutting up shop after serving the customer. Before leaving the store, she counted up all the money in the till and headed to the back room where she would store the money, where it's usually kept. At 10:17 p.m, she activated the alarm system and headed back to her car in the parking lot outside the store. And it's not known what happened to Cheryl past this point, as there was never any sign of her. Now, it's worth noting that Trudy Darby's case was ultimately solved 3 years later when a 15-year-old and his half-brother were caught bragging about getting away with this murder and having confessed after being investigated by local authorities. However, at the time of Angela's disappearance and her case and the search for her, these two cases in particular had piqued the interest of investigators, as they all had what they deemed as similar details, including around the same time of the disappearances, and each of them having occurred in small, close-knit towns where these young women were out alone, late at night, seemingly vulnerable. But sadly, as a result of no new changes in the case, the friends and family of Angela had to begin continuing their lives as normal. Rob headed out of Clinton to train for the National Guardsman as he had planned, while Angela's best friend Kyla had followed up on her plans of moving to Colorado. Towards the end of 1991, Angela's mother actually won a holiday to Florida, and initially she had refused to leave Clinton while her daughter's case was still open and she was still missing, but her loved ones had eventually convinced her to go and just give herself some rest. Around the end of 1991, a potential new avenue of investigation had been provided from someone called Russell Smith. He'd been from Canada, but he'd been visiting some family that were living in a place called Ulrich, Missouri. I apologise if I mispronounced that. He had not heard of Angela's case whatsoever due to not being from the area until he came across one of the missing persons posters plastered around the area. Immediately, he appeared to recognise the missing woman and he reported his claim to the police. He stated that in September of 1991, he had seen a woman that he claimed looked exactly like Angela getting into a green pickup truck with a white top and a fish mural on the back window as it was pulling away from a drugstore in Selkirk in Canada. They followed up on this sighting immediately and came to the conclusion that by the time the sighting had occurred, she would have likely given birth to her child, considering she was 4 months pregnant when she had disappeared. Investigators had contacted all of the hospitals in the area around where this alleged sighting had taken place, just asking if they could recall anyone matching Angela's description having visited there or checked in, but nobody appeared to recognise her. And in December of 1991, Angela's case was actually featured on Unsolved Mysteries in the hopes that perhaps, since the programme was so wide-reaching, there may be new sightings or new information that could come forward from someone who hadn't already been aware of her disappearance. In the following year, another huge case occurred, that of the disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter and Stacey McCall in Springfield, Missouri. Angela's mother Marcia and Stacey McCall's mother Janice had actually become close friends, and the pair would continue to aid each other in spreading awareness for each of their daughters' cases. The pair had even been guests on the Oprah Winfrey every show in the hopes of their stories reaching new people and potentially leading to new leads in the case, but sadly they had no such luck. And in terms of Angela's case specifically, the hunt for the perpetrator was not successful for years. Investigators had looked into the pair responsible for Trudy Darby's murder as potentially being involved, but they were ultimately ruled out as having any involvement in Angela's case. And sadly that is where I'm going to end this video. That's all the information I could find on Angela Hammond's case. So I genuinely do hope for all of Angela's loved ones that she's safe and there are some answers someday. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and please feel free to leave any case requests down below, anything you want me to do on this channel, whether it's a psychology video or whether it's a true crime video. Also, don't forget to check out my second channel where I've been uploading non-educational content on there, so if you want to see more content from me, then head on over there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching.